The man who explained the universe failed the three people who shared his blood. You know the face, the wild grey hair, the soft, tired eyes. The tongue stuck out at a camera that turned him into the most beloved scientist in human history. The world made Albert Einstein a kind of saint, the gentle genius who unlocked the secrets of time and light. But behind that famous smile were three children. One disappeared without a grave, one was locked inside an asylum for 30 years, and one stopped speaking to him entirely. How does a mind that mapped the cosmos lose its way back home? How does a man who could predict the bending of starlight fail to see his own sun breaking apart in front of him? His name was Albert Einstein, and this is the story he never told. 3 children, 3 tragedies, and one secret he buried so deeply that the world would not discover it until 1986, 31 years after his death. There is a daughter whose name he wrote in only a handful of letters, then never spoke aloud again. There is a son whose brilliant mind collapsed into madness while his father sailed to America and never looked back. And there is a son who grew into a man, looked at the great Einstein, and saw a stranger. Most people think they know Einstein. They know the equations. They have never met the father, because the deepest secret he carried to his grave was not physics. It was a single name, Lieserl. In the autumn of 1896, a 17-year-old boy walked into the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. He had already failed once. He had renounced his German citizenship to dodge military service. His own teachers in Munich had called him insolent, a daydreamer who disrupted the class simply by sitting in it. His name was Albert Einstein, and almost nothing about him suggested the future. But in that physics program there was one other student who would change his life. A young woman from Serbia. She walked with a limp from a congenital hip defect. She was 4 years older than the rest, and she was the only woman in the entire department. Her name was Mileva. She was not a footnote. Mileva was one of the sharpest mathematical minds in the school, a woman who had fought through an education system that barely allowed her in the door. And Albert fell for her completely, not for her face, for her mind. Their letters from those years survive. They are stunning. He calls her Doxel, little doll. She calls him Johansel. They write to each other about electrodynamics and molecular forces, the way other couples write about the weather. How happy and proud I will be, he wrote to her, when the two of us together will have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion. The two of us, together. Here is the first question this story refuses to answer simply. How much of the early Einstein was actually Einstein alone? Historians still argue about it today, but that argument hides something far more human and far more painful. Because while these two young scientists were dreaming about the laws of the universe, Mileva was about to become pregnant. They were not married. Albert had no job, no income, and a mother who despised the woman he loved. And the way Albert Einstein handled what came next would set the pattern for everything, for every child, for every tragedy, for the next 50 years. Watch how fast the world changes for this man. In 1902, he is a nobody, rejected for every academic post he applies to. He survives by tutoring children for a few francs an hour and posting a newspaper ad offering private physics lessons. A friend's father finally pulls a string and lands him a job as a clerk, 3rd class, at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. A patent clerk. That is the job Albert Einstein holds when he detonates physics. In January 1903, he marries Mileva in a small civil ceremony. No family from his side attends. In 1904, their son Hans Albert is born in their cramped Bern apartment. Albert is 25, reviewing other men's inventions by day. And then comes 1905. Scientists have a name for it, the miracle year. In a single 12-month stretch, this unknown clerk publishes 4 papers. One explains the photoelectric effect and helps launch quantum theory. It will later win him the Nobel Prize. One proves the existence of atoms. One introduces special relativity, rewriting our understanding of space and time. And the fourth contains 5 symbols that would become the most famous equation on Earth. E equals mc squared. He wrote them at a kitchen table, often with a baby crying in the next room. For a few years the world barely notices. Then it notices everything. Universities that rejected him start begging. Prague, Zurich, Berlin. By 1914, he is a professor in the German capital, sitting among the most powerful scientists alive. A second son, Eduard, has been born in 1910. A delicate, beautiful boy, the family nicknames Tete. On paper, Albert Einstein has everything: a historic mind, a growing family, a career exploding upward. And it is exactly here, at the summit, that the cracks begin. May 29th, 1919. An island off the coast of Africa. A British astronomer named Arthur Eddington points his telescope at a total solar eclipse, searching for starlight, bending around the sun, exactly as Einstein's general relativity had predicted. The starlight bends. The numbers match. On November 7th, 1919, the news crosses the world overnight. The Times of London runs the headline, "Revolution in Science, Newtonian Ideas Overthrown." Days later, the New York Times declares, "Lights all askew in the heavens." In a single morning, a 40-year-old physicist becomes the most famous human being on the planet. Crowds follow him in the street. Reporters camp outside his door. He is mobbed in America like a film star. In 1921, the Nobel Prize finally arrives. This is the image the world keeps forever. The triumphant genius. The smiling sage who outsmarted Isaac Newton. But fame is a spotlight, and a spotlight only lights one thing, while throwing everything around it into deeper shadow. Look closely at the timeline, because it tells a darker story than the headlines. By the morning Einstein became a global icon in 1919, his first marriage was already dead. He and Mileva had divorced that same year, after he handed her a list of cold, written conditions for staying together that read less like a husband's request and more like a master's rules for a servant. She was to do his laundry, bring 3 meals to his room, and expect no affection in return. By 1919, his eldest son barely knew him. His youngest son was a fragile 9-year-old in Zurich, hundreds of miles from his father's new life in Berlin. And there was a third child, older than both boys, whose existence the cheering crowds knew nothing about. The world crowned him in the exact year his family came apart. Both things were true at once: the genius and the absence, the light and the shadow it cast over 3 small lives. The public saw a man who had conquered the universe. His children saw a man who was never there. But to understand how it all unraveled, we cannot start in 1919. We have to go back, to a cold winter in Serbia, 17 years earlier, to a child whose name Einstein would erase from history. A child the world would not even learn existed until 1986. Her name was Lieserl, and what happened to her remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Go back to 1901, before the fame, before the Nobel, before any of it. Albert is 22 and unemployed. Mileva is 25 and, for the second time, has just failed the final exams that would have made her a certified physicist. Exams she sat while pregnant, exhausted, and quietly terrified, because she is carrying Albert's child, and they are not married. In Europe in 1901, for an unmarried woman, this is not a scandal. It is a catastrophe. It can end a career, a reputation, a life. Albert's mother, Pauline, already loathes Mileva. She calls her too old, too foreign, too sickly, and warns her son that the relationship will ruin him. So they hide it. Albert keeps job hunting across Switzerland, sending Mileva love letters full of physics and tenderness. "Be cheerful, and don't fret," he writes. He seems genuinely happy about the baby. In one letter, He muses about whether the child will have her temperament or his. He even, sweetly, wonders what she will look like. But notice what is missing. He never goes to her. As her pregnancy advances, Mileva travels home, alone, to her parents in Novi Sad, in what is now Serbia. Albert stays behind in Switzerland, chasing a paycheck. She will give birth without him in the room. And it is the first time, but not the last, that Albert Einstein chooses his work over a child who needed him there. In late January 1902, in her parents' home in Novi Sad, Mileva Maric gives birth to a baby girl. Albert is roughly 800 kilometers away, in Bern. He does not come. There is no record that he made any attempt to. What we have instead is a letter. On February 4, 1902, he writes to Mileva, and for the only time in his entire life, his words drip with a father's wonder for this specific child. Is she healthy? He asks. And does she cry properly? What kind of little eyes does she have? Whom of us two does she resemble more? Who is giving her milk? He frets that she is too thin. He insists she must be photographed. He even chooses a name with her, Lieserl, a tender Swabian German diminutive. Little Lisa. Read that letter and you hear a young man falling in love with his daughter through ink and paper alone. He calls her our Lieserl. He promises Mileva they will manage somehow, and then silence begins to creep in. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of 1902. An illegitimate child cannot come to Bern. Not if Albert wants the patent office job that is finally, narrowly within his reach. A scandal would sink him before he ever published a word. The most important year of his life, the miracle year, is just around the corner, and it has a price. The price has a name, and she is a few weeks old. What kind of father chooses the equation over the child? Hold that question, because the answer is darker than a simple yes or no, and it would repeat, almost exactly, with the son he loved most. For most of 1902, Lieserl lives with Mileva's family in Serbia, while Albert builds his life in Switzerland. He starts at the patent office. He marries Mileva in January 1903, and, tellingly, Lieserl is not brought to live with them. The daughter stays behind. Then comes the letter that haunts historians to this day. In September 1903, Mileva travels back to Serbia. Something has happened to Lieserl. Albert writes to his wife on September 19, 1903, and his words are no longer those of a doting father. They are careful, clinical, frightened in a very particular way. He asks, "I'm very sorry about what has befallen Lieserl. It's so easy to suffer lasting effects from scarlet fever. If only this will pass." Scarlet fever. In 1903, often a death sentence for an infant. But it is the next line that chills every reader. He asks Mileva, "I'd like once to have a picture of her, and I'd like to know how she is registered. We must take precautions that problems don't later arise for her. How she is registered." That single phrase has launched 100 years of investigation, because registered suggests paperwork, the kind of paperwork that accompanies an adoption. And after that letter, in the entire surviving record of Albert Einstein's life, thousands of letters, decades of correspondence, Lieserl is never mentioned again. Not once, not by him, not by Mileva. She simply vanishes. There are only two possibilities, and both are devastating. The first, Lieserl died of scarlet fever in the autumn of 1903, an infant in a country her father never visited, buried in a grave that has never been found. The second, she was given up for adoption to a Serbian family, raised under another name, never told who her father was, and grew up, perhaps, into an ordinary woman who watched the most famous scientist on Earth on newsreels, never knowing she was looking at her own father. Historians have searched for a century. They have combed Serbian church records, hunted for a grave, traced families in Novi Sad. They have found nothing certain. Albert Einstein's first child remains, to this day, a person without an ending. Here is the part that is hardest to forgive. Albert Einstein lived another 52 years after Lieserl disappeared. 52 years of letters, interviews, autobiographical reflections, and intimate confessions to friends. He wrote about God. He wrote about war, about music, about loneliness, about his own death. He never wrote one public word about his daughter. When he became famous, the secret became permanent. Acknowledging an illegitimate, possibly abandoned child would have detonated the saintly image the world had built around him. So Lieserl was sealed away, not in a grave they could find, but in silence. His own family kept the secret for decades after he died in 1955. It held until 1986, when his granddaughter Evelyn opened a collection of letters between Albert and Mileva that the family had long kept private. Buried in that yellowed correspondence were the references to a baby named Lieserl. The world reacted with disbelief. The gentle genius, the moral conscience of the atomic age, had a hidden daughter no historian had ever heard of. For 84 years, she had not existed in the official story of his life. That is how completely a powerful man can erase a child. But Lieserl was only the first. Because the second tragedy would not stay hidden in a quiet Serbian village. It would unfold in a Zurich psychiatric clinic, in full view of the world, as Einstein's own brilliant son slowly lost his mind, calling out for a father who had already boarded a ship to America and decided never to come back. Move forward 8 years, from a vanished daughter to a growing son. It is 1910, in Zurich, and Mileva gives birth to the couple's third child, a boy. They name him Eduard, but almost from the start they call him Tete. And from the first months, Tete is different from his older brother. Hans Albert is sturdy, practical, stubborn. Eduard is something else entirely. He is fragile, sickly through his whole childhood, in and out of bed with fevers and infections. But he is also luminous. He reads everything. He devours poetry, memorizes long passages of Goethe and Schiller, and sits at the piano playing with a depth that startles adults. He worships his father, and his father, for a time, adores him back. Albert calls him the most gifted of his children. There is a real tenderness there. Letters where the great physicist tries to explain the world to this delicate, brilliant boy who soaks up everything. But here is the cruel setup of this act. The very intensity that makes Eduard extraordinary, the racing mind, the emotional depth, the sensitivity that feels everything too sharply, is the same fire that will eventually consume him. The most gifted child would suffer the most, and the father who could explain the stars would have no equation for what was coming. But before Eduard's story breaks, the family itself breaks first. In 1914, Albert moves the family to Berlin for his prestigious new post. Mileva hates it. The city is cold to her, his relatives are crueler, and Albert has, by now, fallen in love with someone else, his own cousin, Elsa. Within months, the marriage implodes. Mileva takes the two boys, Hans Albert and Eduard, and returns to Zurich. Eduard is 4 years old. Hans Albert is 10. From this point on, they grow up in one country while their father lives in another. This is the moment the relationship with his sons begins to rot. Not in a single explosion, but through distance. Hundreds of miles, months between visits. A father who sends money and letters and physics problems, but who is not in the room when a boy wakes from a nightmare or wins a prize at school. In 1919, the divorce becomes final. Albert marries Elsa almost immediately. As part of the divorce settlement, he makes a remarkable promise. He pledges the money from the Nobel Prize he has not yet won to Mileva and the boys. It is a stunning gesture of provision, but notice the shape of it. He provides money. He does not provide himself. And to his sons, growing up fatherless in Zurich, the difference is everything. You cannot hug a bank transfer. You cannot ask a letter why it left. For a while, Eduard thrives anyway. He is a brilliant student. In the late 1920s, he enrolls at the University of Zurich to study medicine. He wants to become a psychiatrist, a healer of the mind. He falls under the spell of Sigmund Freud. He writes poetry. He writes long, searching letters to his famous father, hungry for connection. Then, around 1930, when Edward is 20, the mind he treasured turns against him. It begins as something dismissed, as a broken heart, a devastating love affair, an older woman, a collapse, but it does not lift. He spirals into deep depression. His behavior turns erratic, then frightening. He rages. He weeps. At one terrible moment, he attacks the very thing he loves most. He tries to throw himself from a window. The diagnosis, when it comes, is the word that defined a generation of lost young people: schizophrenia. The boy who wanted to heal broken minds now has a broken mind of his own. And then comes the line. In the depth of his illness, Edward turns on his father with an accusation no equation could answer. He tells him, in essence, "You brought me into this world, and then you abandoned me." He says he hates him. He says his father had no right to give him a life like this. Albert Einstein, who could describe the curvature of space-time, sat with a son who blamed him for existing and had no answer at all. What happened to Edward over the next 30 years is the longest tragedy in this family. In 1932, he was admitted to the Burghölzli, the famous psychiatric clinic in Zurich. It would become, with breaks, the institution of his life. The treatments of that era were brutal, and brutal in a specific, irreversible way. He was subjected to repeated insulin shock therapy and, by many accounts, electroconvulsive treatments. Those who knew him believed the treatments themselves damaged him, that they dulled the dazzling memory, blunted the brilliant mind, eroded the very gifts that had made him Edward. The healer's mind was being burned out by the medicine meant to save it. Mileva devoted the rest of her life to him. She emptied herself, caring for Edward, physically, financially, completely. The cost of his treatment helped ruin her. She suffered her own strokes, sold property, sank into debt and poor health, and still she would not abandon him. Whatever Albert was as a father, Mileva was the parent who stayed in the room until she physically could not anymore. And Albert? Albert sent letters. He sent money. From a distance, he wrote with real grief about the son he called the most tragic figure in his life. He confided to friends that Edward's illness was the deepest sorrow he carried. He even, chillingly, wondered in writing whether he himself had passed something down, whether the brilliance and the breakdown came from the same bloodline. But the geography never changed. As Edward sank, Albert's life moved in the opposite direction, toward fame, toward America, toward a new world that had no room in it for a son in a Swiss asylum. Which brings us to 1933, to the last time Albert Einstein would ever see his youngest son. Adolf Hitler had just taken power. Einstein, a Jew and the most famous scientist alive, knew he could never live in Germany again. He was leaving Europe for good. And before he sailed, he went to Zurich to say goodbye to Edward. No one could have guessed it then, but the man who measured the cosmos was about to turn his back on his broken son for the final time, and he would never, in 22 more years of life, cross the ocean to see him again. The scene in Zurich in 1933 is almost unbearable to picture. Albert sits with Edward, now 23, already deep inside his illness. There is a photograph from around this period. The father in a suit, the son beside him at a piano. They had once bonded over music. Now there is a wall between them that no shared melody can cross. Witnesses describe an awkward, painful visit. Whatever was said, it did not heal anything. Then Albert stands. He leaves. He boards a ship. And he sails to America, to Princeton, to the second half of one of the most celebrated lives in human history. He never returns to Europe. Not for the rising horror of the war, not for old colleagues, and not for Edward. For the next 22 years, Father and son exist on opposite sides of an ocean and never lay eyes on each other again. They write, "Letters cross the Atlantic, kind and sad and strange." But Albert Einstein, a man who crossed continents for lectures and honors and causes, never once made the journey back to sit with his sick child. He had the means, he had the time, he did not go. That is the wound at the center of this story. Not cruelty in a single moment, but absence, stretched across decades. While Edward sank into the asylum, the eldest son was fighting a different battle with the same father, and his story is the one that proves the pattern. Hans Albert was the survivor. Where Edward shattered, Hans Albert hardened. But growing up under the world's most famous name left its own scars, and the deepest fight came over love, exactly as it had for Albert himself. In the 1920s, Hans Albert fell for a woman named Frieda Knecht. She was 9 years older than him, and Albert decided she was wrong for his son, too old, possibly carrying hereditary illness, a mistake. He fought the marriage with everything he had. He pressured. He warned. He tried to forbid it. If that sounds familiar, it should. Albert's own mother had said almost the identical things about Mileva. Too old, too foreign, too dangerous. 30 years earlier, the father who had been forbidden was now the one doing the forbidding. The pattern repeated itself, generation to generation, like an inherited curse. Hans Albert married Frieda anyway, in 1927. For years, it strained the relationship between father and son, nearly to breaking. But Hans Albert had something Edward never could summon: distance as a weapon. He built his own life. He became a brilliant engineer, an authority on the movement of sediment in rivers, and eventually a respected professor at Berkeley, in the same country as his father, yet still emotionally an ocean apart. He succeeded. He outran the name. But he carried, by his own admission, a complicated grief about the man who had been a headline to the world and a shadow at home. Now look at the full picture in the late 1940s, and the cost becomes staggering. Mileva, the brilliant student who might have been a physicist, the woman who gave up everything, dies in Zurich in 1948. She dies worn down, partially paralyzed by strokes, financially ruined by decades of caring for Edward. In her final years, she had clung to a few coins and her sick son, while her former husband was celebrated on magazine covers an ocean away. With Mileva gone, the last devoted parent Edward had is gone too. Edward spends his remaining years in and out of the Burghölzli, eventually a long-term resident, cared for by strangers and a guardian. The luminous boy who quoted Goethe and dreamed of healing minds becomes a heavy-set, institutionalized man, his memory damaged, his speech strange, smoking constantly, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost. And across the ocean, his father grows into the gentle saint of Princeton, beloved, photographed, quoted, mourned in advance by a world that adored him. Two endings, written by the same man. One son he made into an heir, one son he left to an asylum, and a daughter whose ending no one even knows. So we are left with the question this whole story has been circling. Was Albert Einstein a monster? No. And that is what makes it tragic rather than simple. Read his private letters and you find a man in genuine pain over his children. He called Edward's fate the heaviest sorrow of his life. He agonized over whether his own genes had doomed his son. He provided money faithfully for decades. He wrote, again and again, with what reads as real love. But love on paper is not presence in a life. And Einstein had a flaw that all his genius could not correct. When human relationships became painful, he withdrew into work. He treated intimacy the way he treated a failed theory. He set it aside and moved to the next problem. He once admitted, with brutal honesty, that he had failed twice at marriage and that he was, by nature, solitary to the point of coldness. "I am truly a lone traveler," he wrote, and confessed he had never belonged wholeheartedly to any person, not even his own family. That sentence is the key to everything. The same mind that needed total detachment to see the universe clearly could not bear the messy, demanding closeness of a child in crisis. The strength was the flaw. The genius and the absence came from the same place. He could hold the cosmos in his head. He could not hold his own son's hand through a breakdown. In April 1955, in Princeton, Albert Einstein lies dying. An aneurysm is rupturing inside him. Doctors offer surgery. He refuses it. "I want to go when I want," he says. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He dies on April 18, 1955. But 2 of his 3 children are still out there as he takes his last breath. One son in California, who he has half reconciled with. One son in a Swiss asylum, who he has not seen in 22 years, and who does not yet know that the father he both loved and blamed has just left the world without ever coming back. What happened to Edward after his father died, and the strange final twist in the fate of all 3 children, is where this story ends. When Albert Einstein died in 1955, no one told Edward right away. His caretakers worried what the news might do to him. The father he had loved, worshipped, raged at, and blamed for his very existence was gone, and the son in the Zurich asylum learned of it carefully, gently, as if the truth itself were a fragile thing that might break him further. Edward lived another 10 years. He spent them where he had spent most of his adult life, inside the institution, under the care of strangers and a legal guardian, his brother Hans Albert, managing his affairs from across the ocean in California. The brilliant boy who had quoted Goethe from memory was now a stout, grey, institutionalized man. He still played the piano sometimes, the one thread that survived everything. Visitors described moments of startling clarity breaking through the fog, flashes of the sharp mind that had once dreamed of healing others. On October 25, 1965, Edward Einstein died of a stroke inside the psychiatric clinic in Zurich. He was 55 years old. He had spent more than 30 of those years in institutions. He never married. He had no children. He had not seen his father in 32 years. The most gifted of Einstein's children was buried in Zurich, far from the famous grave of a father who was never there. And for decades, almost no one visited. Stop and hold all 3 of them in your mind at once. Lieserl, the daughter erased before she could even form a memory of her father. No grave we can find, no photograph anyone has identified. A name in a handful of letters, and then a silence that swallowed her whole. Edward, the luminous, broken son, who wanted to heal minds and lost his own, who waited in an asylum for a father who chose an ocean over a visit, and died there without him. Hans Albert, the survivor, who outran the name and built a life of his own, but carried to the end a quiet, complicated ache about the man the whole world claimed to love. 3 children, one vanished, one institutionalized, one estranged, and one father who could read the secret language of the universe, but never learned to speak the simple language of staying. Here is the part that should haunt you. Einstein was not a cruel man. He was, in his way, a gentle one, kind to strangers, devastated by injustice, generous to causes across the globe. He grieved his children in private. He just could not be present for them, and the very detachment that let his mind float free among the stars was the same detachment that left 3 human beings reaching for a father who was always, somehow, somewhere else. His greatest equations described how distant objects bend toward one another across empty space. He never solved the distance inside his own family, and then, 31 years after he died, the secret broke open. In 1986, a collection of 54 love letters between Albert and Mileva, hidden away by the family for generations, was unsealed and brought to auction. Scholars opened them and found, woven through the tenderness of two young scientists in love, the references to a baby named Lieserl, a daughter no biographer had ever known existed. A child the most documented genius of the 20th century had successfully hidden from history for 84 years. Historians scrambled. They searched Serbia. They hunted church records, scarlet fever death registries, adoption papers, family lines in Novi Sad. To this day, they have found no certain answer. Lieserl may have died as an infant in 1903. She may have been quietly adopted and lived a long, ordinary life under another name, never knowing whose blood she carried. We may never know, but the discovery changed how the world sees him. The gentle saint of Princeton, the moral conscience of the atomic age, had carried a hidden daughter and a forsaken son all the way to his grave, and let the world believe in a simpler, kinder story. The man who taught us that time and space are not what they seem turned out to have a self that was not what it seemed either. There is one last, quiet irony. Of the three children, only Hans Albert carried the bloodline forward, and even there, tragedy followed. Of his own children, one daughter died in infancy, and his son Klaus died of diphtheria at just 6 years old. The Einstein name survived, but barely, and not without its own fresh griefs. The most famous mind in human history left almost no living legacy of blood. The genius radiated outward to all of humanity, and dimmed, almost to nothing, in his own family line. So what do we do with a story like this? We grew up with one Einstein, the wild-haired genius, the playful sage, the face on the poster that told us to stay curious. That Einstein was real. The equations were real. The kindness to strangers was real. But there was another Einstein too, a father who named a daughter he would later erase, a father who sat with a brilliant, breaking son, and then sailed away for the last time, a father who provided everything except himself. Both were the same man. And maybe that is the hardest truth this story has to offer, that genius does not make a person whole, that a mind capable of holding the entire universe can still have a hole in it, shaped exactly like the people who needed him most. We like to believe that the people who changed the world must have mastered their own lives first. Einstein is the proof that it is not so. He reached the stars and lost his own children in the dark beneath them. The next time you see that famous face, the tongue out, the eyes twinkling, remember the three names the photograph does not show: Lieserl, Eduard, Hans Albert, a genius the whole world loved, and three children who only ever wanted him in the room. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember the ones history leaves in the margins, the children of great men, standing just outside the frame of the photograph. Because behind almost every legend, there is someone who paid the price for it. Thank you for watching, and if you want more true stories of the people history left in the shadows, stay with us. There are so many more left to tell.